The winter of 1896 arrived early in the Wyoming Territory. Snow covered the mountains weeks before anyone expected, turning the valleys into endless fields of white. Fierce winds swept across the Rocky Mountains, burying trails beneath deep drifts and leaving travelers with only two choices: find shelter or risk never being seen again. Most ranchers stayed close to home during storms like these, but Ethan Calloway was different. At 35 years old, Ethan had become one of the wealthiest cattle ranchers in the territory. His ranch stretched across thousands of acres. His barns were filled with fine horses, and his cattle numbered in the thousands. Yet despite his success, the grand log house overlooking the valley always felt empty. 5 years earlier, Ethan had lost his wife and unborn child during a harsh winter fever. Since then, he had buried himself in work. The people in nearby Silver Creek admired his generosity. Whenever a family lost livestock, Ethan quietly replaced it. If a widow couldn't pay her debts, someone always left a pouch of gold on her porch before sunrise. Yet no amount of wealth could fill the silence that waited for him every evening. That morning, snowflakes drifted gently from a gray sky as Ethan saddled his favorite white stallion, Ghost. His ranch foreman, Samuel, stepped onto the porch, wrapping his coat tightly against the cold. "You're not really heading into the mountains today." Ethan tightened Ghost's saddle. "I need to check the north cabins." Samuel shook his head. "A storm's coming. I'll be back before dark." The older man looked toward the mountains. "I've lived here 40 years. When the crows disappear, you should too." Ethan glanced upward. The sky was strangely quiet. No birds, no movement, only endless white clouds gathering over the peaks. He smiled politely. "I'll be careful." Within minutes, horse and rider disappeared into the snow-covered forest. For hours, Ethan followed the narrow mountain trail. Pine trees bent beneath the weight of fresh snow while frozen streams sparkled beneath pale winter sunlight. Although the air was bitterly cold, the scenery remained breathtaking. Then Ghost suddenly stopped. The horse refused to take another step. Ethan frowned. "What is it, boy?" Ghost snorted nervously. His ears pointed toward a distant ridge. Ethan listened carefully. At first, nothing. Then, a faint sound carried through the wind. Someone crying, very softly, almost impossible to hear. Ethan quickly dismounted. The sound came again, a woman's voice. "Wake!" Desperate, he grabbed a lantern and carefully climbed the snowy hillside toward the sound. Each step sank knee-deep into the snow. The wind grew stronger. Branches snapped overhead. Finally, he reached a narrow clearing. There, beside a broken pine tree, lay a young woman curled beneath a torn wool blanket. Her clothes were soaked with melting snow. Her boots were badly worn. Long dark hair covered part of her pale face. She wasn't moving. Ethan rushed forward. "Miss." No answer. He knelt beside her and gently checked for a pulse. Weak, but steady. She was alive. He carefully brushed snow away from her face. Her cheeks were red from the freezing wind. Small cuts marked her hands. She looked as though she had been walking for days. As Ethan lifted her blanket, he froze. Around her neck hung a silver locket, the exact same design his late wife had once worn. His heart pounded. It couldn't be. He stared for several long seconds before forcing himself to focus. Who she was didn't matter. Not now. She needed help. Without hesitation, Ethan removed his heavy fur coat and wrapped it around her trembling body. Then he carefully lifted her into his arms. She was frighteningly light. Ghost stood patiently nearby as Ethan placed her gently across the saddle. Just as he climbed onto the horse, the storm arrived. A violent blast of wind swept across the mountain. Snow filled the air so quickly the trail vanished in seconds. Visibility dropped to only a few feet. Ethan pulled Ghost's reins. "Easy, boy." The horse moved carefully through the blizzard. Every landmark disappeared beneath blowing snow. Even Ethan, who had ridden these mountains since childhood, struggled to recognize the trail. Minutes became an hour. The cold grew unbearable. The woman suddenly whispered something. Her voice was barely audible. "Don't." Ethan leaned closer. "What did you say?" Her lips trembled. They single quotes coming. Then she lost consciousness again. Ethan looked back. The mountains behind them had vanished into white darkness. But something, or someone, was moving through the storm. At first he thought it was only drifting snow. Then he saw them. 3 riders, barely visible, following their tracks. His grip tightened on the reins. Whoever they weren't turning back, and for the first time in years, Ethan realized that rescuing one stranger might become the most dangerous decision of his life. The blizzard roared through the mountains like a living thing. Snow whipped across Ethan Calloway's face as he urged Ghost carefully down the hidden trail. Every few seconds he glanced over his shoulder. The 3 riders remained there, appearing and disappearing through the blowing snow like dark shadows. "They're still following us," Ethan muttered. Ghost snorted uneasily. The unconscious young woman leaned against Ethan's chest, barely breathing beneath his heavy coat. Her face had become frighteningly pale. "We're getting you home," he whispered. "Just hold on." The wind grew even stronger. Branches cracked overhead before crashing into the snow. One enormous pine tree fell across the trail, only yards ahead. Ghost stopped instantly. Ethan quickly guided the horse around the fallen tree, but the detour forced them onto a narrow mountain path he hadn't used in years. Behind them, one of the riders shouted, "There, I see them." Ethan's heart raced. They weren't lost anymore. They had been found. He pressed his heels gently against Ghost's sides. The powerful white stallion broke into a careful gallop despite the deep snow. For nearly 20 minutes, they raced through the storm. Finally, a familiar wooden cabin appeared between the trees. It was one of Ethan's old hunting cabins, built years earlier for emergencies exactly like this one. He quickly dismounted and carried the young woman inside. The cabin was cold and dark. He immediately lit the fireplace. Within minutes, warm flames filled the small room. He laid the woman gently on a wool blanket beside the fire. Her hands were freezing. Her lips had turned blue. Ethan heated water over the fire and carefully wrapped warm blankets around her shoulders. After several minutes, she finally opened her eyes. Large green eyes slowly focused on him. Fear instantly filled her expression. She tried to sit up. "Easy," Ethan said softly. "You're safe." She looked around the cabin in confusion. "Where am I?" "My hunting cabin." She closed her eyes briefly. "The mountain ... You collapsed," she whispered. "You should have left me." Ethan looked surprised. "I wasn't going to leave someone to freeze." A tear rolled down her cheek. "You don't understand." "Help me understand." She hesitated. "My name is Grace." "Ethan." She nodded weakly. "I've been running for 3 days." "From who?" Before she could answer, 3 loud knocks echoed against the cabin door. Both froze. Another knock. Then a man's voice. "We know you're in there." Grace's face lost all color. "They found me." Ethan quietly stood. He picked up the Winchester rifle hanging beside the fireplace. "Stay behind me." The knocking became louder. "We're only looking for the woman." Ethan answered through the closed door. "She's not leaving." The man laughed. "You don't even know who she is." "I know enough." Silence followed. Then another voice. "She's a thief." Grace shook her head desperately. "No." Ethan looked at her. "Is that true?" She stared into his eyes. "No." He believed her. Outside, the first man spoke again. "Last chance, Cowboy." Ethan calmly loaded another cartridge into the rifle. "You boys should ride home." One outlaw laughed. "You planning to fight all 3 of us?" Ethan smiled slightly. "If I have to." The wind howled around the cabin. For several long moments no one moved. Then, a gunshot shattered the silence. Boom! The cabin window exploded. Glass flew across the room. Grace screamed. Ethan fired back instantly. His bullet struck the snow inches from one rider's horse. The frightened animal reared, throwing its rider to the ground. The remaining 2 outlaws quickly pulled back behind nearby trees. The standoff had begun. Inside the cabin, Grace looked at Ethan in disbelief. "You don't even know me." He kept his eyes on the window. "No." "Then why are you risking your life?" Ethan answered quietly. "Because someone once saved mine." She stared at him. "My wife." His voice softened. "Years ago, strangers helped us during a terrible winter." He glanced toward the fire. "I've never forgotten their kindness." Grace lowered her eyes. "My father used to say." She paused. "The measure of a person's wealth isn't counted in gold." Ethan smiled faintly. "What was the rest?" She whispered. "It's counted in the lives they choose to save." For the first time since finding her, Ethan saw hope replace fear in her eyes. Outside, the outlaws gathered behind the trees. One of them spoke quietly. The boss wants her alive. The other nodded. And the cowboy? The leader's expression became cold. He made his choice. Inside the cabin, neither Ethan nor Grace realized that the three riders were only the beginning. Far below the mountain, their leader was already gathering more men. By sunrise, the richest cowboy in Wyoming would discover that rescuing one lonely woman had placed a target on everyone he loved. The wind screamed outside the hunting cabin as snow continued piling against the walls. Ethan Calloway stood beside the shattered window, Winchester rifle pressed against his shoulder, watching the pine trees where the three outlaws had taken cover. For nearly 5 minutes, no one fired, no one spoke. Only the crackling fireplace and the howl of the storm filled the silence. Grace wrapped the wool blanket tighter around herself. They're waiting. Ethan nodded. They know we're trapped until the storm passes. She lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. You've already said that. If I had never come into these mountains... they would have found someone else to hurt. Grace looked at him with surprise. You really believe that? Ethan smiled faintly. Bad men don't need a reason. Suddenly, a horse neighed outside. Then another. Ethan carefully peeked through the broken window. His expression immediately changed. They've got company. Grace slowly stood. How many? He counted quietly. 1, 2, 5, 8. Her face turned pale. 8 armed riders now surrounded the cabin. At their center rode a tall man wearing a long black wool coat and an expensive black cowboy hat. Unlike the others, he wasn't carrying a rifle. Only a polished silver revolver rested at his side. The man dismounted slowly and walked toward the cabin door. Every outlaw remained completely silent. Grace whispered one terrified word. Marshall. Ethan looked at her. Who's Marshall? She swallowed hard. The man who owns them. A firm knock echoed through the cabin. 3 slow knocks. The stranger spoke calmly. Mr. Calloway. His voice was smooth, confident, almost friendly. I'd like to speak with you. Ethan answered through the closed door. I'm listening. My name is Richard Marshall. I didn't ask. A faint chuckle came from outside. I admire courage. Ethan remained silent. Marshall continued. The young woman inside stole something very valuable from me. Grace shook her head desperately. He's lying. Marshall heard her. No, Grace, you stole it. I took back what belonged to my family. Marshall sighed. You always were stubborn. Ethan frowned. What exactly did she steal? Marshall answered immediately. A deed. Grace stepped beside Ethan. Tell him the truth. Marshall smiled. The truth. He slowly removed a folded document from his coat. The ranch where you stand once belonged to my company. Ethan narrowed his eyes. My family built this land, so they believed. Grace grabbed Ethan's arm. Don't listen to him. Marshall calmly continued. Years ago my company loaned money to dozens of ranchers, and they failed to pay. Grace shouted. You burned their homes. Marshall ignored her. They signed contracts. They couldn't read. Silence followed. Marshall finally spoke again. Business is business. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had heard stories. Small ranchers losing everything because wealthy businessmen tricked them into signing false agreements. Most people believed those stories were exaggerated. Now, he wasn't so sure. Marshall looked toward the cabin. Grace's father discovered the original ownership records. Grace's breathing became heavier. He hid them. Marshall nodded. Until she found them. Ethan slowly turned toward Grace. The deed. She reached inside her coat. Carefully, she removed a folded leather envelope. Inside rested an old property deed. Its paper had yellowed with age. A large official government seal remained visible across the top. Ethan examined it. The land belonged, not to Marshall, but to Grace's parents. Marshall smiled coldly. That's mine. Grace answered firmly. No, it proves my father never sold our ranch. Marshall's friendly expression disappeared. Enough. He slowly drew his silver revolver. I'm finished asking. Every outlaw raised their rifles. Inside the cabin, Ethan quietly loaded another cartridge. 8 rifles, 1 Winchester. The odds couldn't have been worse. Grace looked toward the back window. We can escape. Ethan shook his head. They've surrounded us. Another long silence followed. Then, a distant horn echoed through the mountains. Marshall frowned. One outlaw looked behind him. Horses. Dozens of horses. Coming fast. Within moments, nearly 20 riders appeared through the storm. Leading them was Samuel, Ethan's loyal foreman. Behind him rode ranch hands from the Calloway ranch. Every man carried a rifle. Samuel smiled beneath his gray beard. "Told you I'd come." Marshall's smile vanished. The peaceful mountain clearing suddenly held nearly 30 armed cowboys. Neither side moved. Snow drifted quietly between them. Samuel rode beside Ethan's cabin. "You all right, boss?" Ethan nodded. "Better now." Marshall looked around carefully. For the first time, he realized he no longer held the advantage. He slowly holstered his revolver. "This isn't over," Samuel answered. "No, it isn't." Marshall mounted his horse. Before leaving, he looked directly at Grace. "You can't hide forever." Then, he turned toward Ethan. "And neither can you." The riders disappeared into the blizzard as quickly as they had arrived. Silence returned once again. Samuel entered the cabin. He looked toward Grace. Who's the young lady?" Before Grace could answer, she suddenly collapsed. Ethan caught her before she hit the floor. Her forehead burned beneath his hand. Samuel frowned. "She's got a fever." Ethan looked toward the mountains where Marshall had disappeared. He knew this battle wasn't over. Marshall hadn't risked 8 armed men for a single piece of paper. Whatever Grace carried was far more valuable than a simple land deed. And somewhere inside that old leather envelope was a secret powerful enough to make one of the richest men in the territory wage war against a stranger. End of Chapter 1, Part 3. If you enjoyed this chapter, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Chapter 1 continues as Ethan discovers the truth about Grace's family and why Richard Marshall will stop at nothing to silence her forever.